Chapter 5. The Deepwater Festival. Tika was panicking. Not a mild variety of panic either. This wasn't the frantic dismay one feels when they lock themselves out of their house. It wasn't that sort of jittery dread felt before going on stage to give a big performance to a panel of judges. Nor was it the shaky anticipation of opening a store for the first time and fearing you didn't do enough to advertise its presence. No, this was a far deeper panic. A fight-or-flight response of the highest order. The sort of terrifying thrill one feels when they know that they are one small misstep, one innocuous mistake, from having their fleetingly short existence come to a swift but horrifically brutal end.
Bradigan, I need you to say it,
she practically begged of the dwarven enchanter, spinning to face him.
I need you to say the words out loud.
Tika, I need you to calm down. Bradigan tried to assure her for what must have been the 100th time. You're not going to help yourself by getting worked up like this.
Just say it, Brad!
Tika practically clawed at him, her claws fidgeting over her chest.
Just say it!
Bradigan rolled his eyes, crossed his arms over his chest, and gave the panicking bird a coy smirk. Fine. No, the dress does not make you look fat. You look great. Tika clacked her beak several times, not entirely sure she believed him.
Are you sure?
She asked, once again working herself up.
Are you absolutely sure? You're not just saying that to make me feel better, right?
Ain't hammer girl, you look fine. Bradigan exclaimed alongside an exasperated laugh. He stepped forward and pressed the tip of his finger to Tika's beak. She chirped, her eyes crossing and her thoughts stalling for a second. A moment later, she pouted at him.
Not fair.
Bradigan smirked. Kid, you were absolutely melting down. I had to do something, he told her, then clapped her on the back. Now, take a breath, calm down, and tell me what's got you in such a fit, and why you're trying to gussy yourself up. Tika took in a long, deep breath, slowly calming down her flighty nerves. She took a step to the side and collapsed into her chair, her eyes wandering aimlessly around her room. It was a modest space with a warm, fluffy bed tucked into a corner, a chest of drawers across from it, and a fully stocked vanity. A handful of shelves along the walls were loaded with books on enchantment and objects that she kept in view for sentimental value. Using the familiar space to ground herself, Tika ran a hand down her face, careful not to accidentally scratch her beak, and spoke.
Okay. So, I told you about that new friend of mine, right? Avaline?
She finally said, looking at Bradigan. He quirked a brow at the word friend, but said nothing about it. Aye, you've only mentioned her like 3 dozen times, he pointed out flatly. Tika blushed, and inwardly she had to admit she had been gushing, but only a little bit. She nodded.
Yeah, her. Well, last time we hung out, she invited me down to Archshade for the festival. I'm supposed to head down there and meet up with her, but she also runs a stand with her dad and...
Oh, I get it, Bradigan said, his face lighting up with realization. Meeting the parents. Yeah, that's always nerve-wracking. You want to look your best for them, don't you? Tika nodded slowly.
Uh-huh.
Bradigan chuckled, then stroked his beard thoughtfully. Well, I'll be damned. You're just moving right along, aren't you? Tika tilted her head, genuinely confused.
What does that mean?
Bradigan shook his head. Never you mind. He dismissed, much to Tika's great annoyance. He was clearly not saying something. But before she could press the subject, he came up to her and leaned forward slightly. At any rate, You've got nothing to worry about, little missy. Tika tilted her head the other way.
I don't?
Bradigan shook his head again. You don't? I mean, yeah, you don't want to go down there looking like a back alley gutter mutt. But you don't have to go out of your way to look like a bleeding fancy noble either. I mean, for one thing, that ain't who you are, so don't go peacocking around like it. For another thing, the way you look shouldn't really mean a whole lot to someone worth spending your time with. Tika tapped the tips of her fingers together, rolling the words around. Intellectually, she recognized that what Bradigan said was probably the truth, but emotionally, she still felt horrifically underprepared. She flicked her eyes up at him as her beak remained pointed at the floor.
You mean it?
Bradigan grinned, then gestured at himself. Kiddo, if looks were so damn important, do you think I'd be this bloody successful? Tika perked up.
But your beard is incredible!
Incredible? Aye. Full of crumbs and spittle? Also aye. Bradigan countered without missing a beat. My point is, if someone's gonna be getting on your case for not looking like the pinnacle of a perfection, they probably aren't someone you'll want to spend time with. Tika nodded and took another deep breath.
Right. Still, I want to make a good first impression, that's all.
Bradigan smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. I hear you, kiddo, I hear you. Don't get me wrong, some prep won't go unappreciated. Just don't go blowing it out of proportion, eh? You're fine just the way you are. There's a damn good reason why most everyone who meets you says you're cute. So have a little faith in yourself, yeah? Tika took in one last deep breath to settle her nerves. She smiled widely at Bradigan.
Right. I will. Thank you, Brad. I think I'm feeling a little better.
It's what I do, Bradigan said with a grin of his own. He helped her to her feet. Now, all that panicking's made you all kinds of disheveled. Let's get you at least a little neat, eh?
Yeah, sure.
Tika agreed, allowing herself to be guided for the vanity.
Sorry for freaking out so much.
Nah, you're fine, Bradigan dismissed. The jitters hit everybody first time around. No shame in it. And frankly, I'm just glad to see my little birdie getting so close to someone. Tika giggled at the term of endearment.
Well, thanks for the confidence. I bet Avaline isn't freaking out like this, though.
Bradigan smiled knowingly. Oh, I'm not sure I'd be so certain of that. Aveline stared at her reflection in the mirror she kept in her bedroom, easily the most expensive thing she owned. Time and use had taken their toll on the reflective surface. Scratch marks and long caked-on smears marred the image of the woman staring back at her, leaving her looking more tired and battered than she felt. Still, it was what she had to work with, and use it she did. She'd been staring at herself for a while now, a wild storm of thoughts running through her mind. There were the obvious considerations of the festival. She would have to leave her house any minute to get the stand started with her father, and there would be a healthy stream of people wanting to buy her little crafts. But beyond the mundane concerns of the day's business, there was also the concern of who would be coming to spend the day with her down here. Her eyes drifted slowly from her face and down to her left arm. Timidly, she lifted the sleeve of her shirt to get a better look. She cringed at the bandages wrapped around her upper arm.
These need to be changed,
she thought grimly to herself. It wouldn't be a pleasant process. It never was. She took a deep breath and gingerly touched the tips of her fingers to the bandages. The muscles underneath flinched involuntarily at the touch, and she hissed quietly through tightly clenched teeth. Not quietly enough, sadly. Ava? You okay in there? Came the muffled voice of her father from the other side of her bedroom wall. Avaline jumped in place, squeaking before spinning around.
Yes, Dad, I just stubbed my toe, that's all.
She called back, quickly conjuring an excuse. There was a pause. You didn't break it, did you?
No, Dad.
Aveline refuted, slowly relaxing as he accepted the lie. There was another pause, then a chuckle. You have got to be more careful, Avaline, her father said in an almost whimsical tone. Now are you about ready? Aveline turned to look at herself in the mirror. She cringed at the bandages.
Almost,
she called over her shoulder.
I might be a minute. You go on ahead and get the stall ready. I'll catch up.
There was another brief pause. When her father spoke again, she could hear the knowing smirk that had plastered itself across his face. Are you trying to doll yourself up for that new friend of yours you keep talking about? Avaline's face turned a furious shade of red, and she found herself grateful for the walls blocking her from view. She buried her face in her hands all the same, though.
Dad,
she whined. There was another laugh, this one far more infuriating. She heard her father's bedroom door pop open. I'll take that as a yes, came the response. Don't worry, take your time. I'll see you at the stand, Ava.
I hate you,
Avaline called, though there was no animosity in her voice. Love you too, hun, came her father's practiced response. Another door opened and closed, and Avaline was alone in the house. She let out a huff of indignation, then turned back to look at herself in the mirror. With a grimace, she reached out and brushed as much of the dirt and grime off as she could.
Dolling myself up. How am I even supposed to do that?
She thought bitterly. It wasn't like she had any makeup. That stuff was expensive, and she needed that money to feed herself. Although, the more she looked at herself, the more she realized that she certainly wasn't looking her best right now. She cringed at the stray strands of her hair that poked out at odd and unusual angles, or the dirt that really was sticking to a few points of her face. There wasn't much she could do to make herself pretty, and nor did she particularly care to. But at the same time... She smiled softly, her hand drifting for an old, well-used brush she kept nearby.
Well, I suppose a bit of tidying up won't hurt,
she muttered.
I don't want to scare away our customers after all. Or Tika.
Her hand stopped short of the brush the moment she mentioned the name, and her eyes darted back to her left arm. She frowned. After a moment, she rolled up her sleeve again and grimaced at the bandages. The skin underneath was already throbbing in anticipation.
First things first,
she decided. With a shudder, she began to peel the bandages away. Tika spent another hour or so in Bradigan's workshop, making sure she looked all right and doing some last-minute reading up on the history and purpose of this festival, just to make sure she understood the significance of it. In the past, she had only ever participated in the festivities because there were games, prizes, and plenty of junk food, but the cultural weight of the celebration was not something she'd ever given much thought to. Apparently, it was meant to recognize the achievements of the community over the spring and summer seasons, particularly where it related to the fishing industries in the lower city. Underbridge had started as a pit-stop fishing hamlet after all, and though it had long outgrown that, its origins remained etched into its culture. Bradigan had wanted to come along with her, of course, but a fresh commission they received the day prior forced him to stay behind. Tika felt bad leaving him to do the work all on his own, but he assured her that he would be fine. He had been doing this work for years before she became his apprentice, and it wasn't a particularly complicated project. So with that reassurance, Tika set out. She emerged onto the streets of Archshade right before noon, just as the sun was phasing behind the ring for the onset of short night. Tika drew up short at the top of a small hill, her beak falling open as she beheld the sights. She was used to the Deepwater Festival being a vibrant and energetic affair up on the arch, and so she was expecting colors and plenty of activity. What she was not expecting was for that energy of the lower city celebrations to absolutely eclipse what was found above. Banners, tarps, and tapestries hung from walls, clotheslines, and every other conceivable surface they could cling to. Not that Tika could really see them through the swirling throng of people. The density of the crowds last time she was here was put to absolute shame. Scattered throughout the chaos, she could see open spaces where musicians played lively music, encouraging people to dance. In many of these squares, elaborate stands and games had been put together. Some were themed after the Arcanian assemblage or magic, but most were themed after fish, or the act of fishing. And speaking of fish, there were practical fleets of fishing canoes out on the water of the lake, and Tika's keen eyes picked out even more people lining the stony shore with fishing rods set. Away from the water, entire streets had been converted into chaotic market lanes. She could hear the traveling merchants and local volunteers hawking their goods from here. And that was just the obvious activity. There was so much going on down there that it sent Tika's mind spinning with sensory overload. She put a hand up against a lamppost and just stared at it all for a few seconds. She almost felt the way she had when she had first come to Underbridge. Small, intimidated, and dreadfully out of place. She collected herself a moment later, puffing up her chest to make herself feel big, and set off at a brisk pace. Avaline had given her instructions on where to go before they parted ways, and if she didn't find Avaline there, Tika could just go to her house. The crowd was even more hectic up close. Tika found herself routinely jostled as she navigated the streets. Her apologies were immediately lost in the white noise around her. Not like it would have mattered, as the recipients of her apologies were always gone by the time she said them. Still, she quickly picked up the crowd's patterns. Fittingly, it flowed like the waters of a river, with waves and tides. That meant all she had to do was swim with the current, so to speak. She was feeling comfortable with navigating the massive bodies when a sharp and familiar sound caught her ear. Avaline's telltale whistle, high and melodic, sliced effortlessly through the din. It sounded more focused this time, purposeful. Tika focused on it like a beacon and followed it as swiftly as she could. She stepped into a wide thoroughfare, finally affording her some personal space. This appeared to be the heart of the festival, where the bulk of the stalls were set up. Tika looked up and down the street, momentarily awestruck once again by the pretty colors and fascinating sounds. Scanning the walls, she soon spied her quarry less than a block down the way. Avaline was standing next to a wooden stall, swaying in tune with her whistles as men and women walked by, many of whom paused to examine the curious knickknacks on display. Tika stopped mid-step, just staring at Avaline for a moment. The girl's movements were practiced and precise. She flowed from one thing to the next with effortless grace, and she wore a radiant smile on her face that lit up everything around her. Tika didn't even realize that she was staring until someone jostled her. Someone had bumped into her from behind. She staggered forward with a caw of alarm. Realizing she'd been occupying the middle of the road, she lurched back into motion and made for Avaline's stall. The human spotted Tika as she approached. She smiled widely and turned to greet her.
Tika, there you are.
Her eyes flew wide as she looked at the Kraven up and down.
Oh, wow. You look good.
Tika felt her face warming up, and a flustered giggle escaped her.
Aw, thanks. So do you.
She returned the compliment. Avaline rolled her eyes.
Not really. I brushed my hair, and I washed my face, and I put on a clean shirt. But that's about it, really.
Tika, unwilling to let that self-directed slander slide, brought a fist down into an open palm like a gavel strike.
Hey! Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and mine are happy with what they see. So no putting yourself down.
Avaline's face turned red, and she looked off to one side.
Thank you.
She mumbled, idly toying with a strand of her hair as her lips creaked up into a timid smile. From behind Avaline, a human man leaned over the stall to shoot Tika a quizzical glance. "Oh, my daughter's beautiful, is she?" he said. Tika went rigid and pale, her beak clacking shut in terror as she realized that, 1, she had just said that, and 2, that was probably Avaline's father, and 3, he had just heard her say that. He was a middle-aged man with graying brown hair and a short, wiry beard that, when accompanied by his sharp-angled eyebrows, lent his face an air of intensity.
Oh, gods, she was right. He does have a threatening beard.
Tika thought as he examined her over his sharp, pointed nose. He frowned in contemplation. It was like he was sizing up if she would make a decent meal or not. Avaline rolled her eyes and marched over to smack him on the back of the head.
Dad, stop staring. You're being weird.
The man let out a laugh and playfully swatted Avaline's hand away from him. "Relax, I'm just playing," he said before fixing Tika with a much warmer smile. It reminded her a lot of Bradigan in a way, and she allowed herself to relax. Avaline's father stood up and held out a hand. "Name's Tyvis. I'm Ava's father. It's a pleasure to meet you, Tika." Tika returned the smile and took his hand.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine, Tyvis. I'm Tika, the greatest enchantress there ever was.
Tyvis blinked.
In training.
She corrected. Tyvis laughed and released her hand. He turned to Avaline and flashed her a sly wink. "I like her already," he said before settling back into his seat with a sigh. You know, Avaline's told me all about you." Tika blinked, taken aback.
Huh, she has?
She questioned, glancing at Avaline. Avaline looked away slightly, fidgeting with her bracelet. Tyvis nodded. "Yeah, only all the bloody time. I've never known my daughter to be such a chatterbox about, well, anything. But with you, it's like she can't stop." He leaned forward conspiratorially. "You didn't go and place a spell on her, did ya?" Tika shook her head.
Nope, nuh-uh. No spells here.
Tyvis grinned. Then she just really likes you," he said before leaning back in his seat. "Honestly, I'm glad. It's nice to see you're making more friends." Tika nodded along quietly, genuinely surprised. Between her and Avaline, Tika was for sure the more talkative of the two. To hear that Avaline had been gushing about her? Tika shook herself and banished her surprise. What right did she have acting surprised when she was guilty of exactly the same thing? She turned her eyes to Avaline's various crafts on display on the stand. She let out a low coo of astonishment as she picked one up to look it over. It was a dragon. Its serpentine body comprised of glued-together bits of wood and artistically placed pebbles, while the membranes of its wings were made from strips of stray cloth.
Wow. I knew you were good, Avaline, but this is amazing.
Tika whispered, turning the craft over in her hands.
Like, wow! I've never seen a dragon made this well before. I bet you worked really hard on it.
Avaline eyed the piece, her face lighting up from the praise.
Thank you. I'm glad you like it. And I did work really hard on it, you're right. The wings were the tricky part,
she said, coming over to point things out.
Now, you see, I couldn't make them too thin at the joints, or the whole thing would just fall apart. If I made them too thick, it wouldn't look right. The dragon would look fat. Finding enough stray cloth to make the membranes work was a huge pain, too, and cutting it to size without accidentally damaging too much was even harder. And don't even get me started on getting it all glued together. My hands had dry glue stuck to them for weeks.
Tyvis gestured at Aveline with a hand. See? Chatterbox. Aveline stiffened and took a step back.
What? Hey!
Typhus leveled a disbelieving grin at his daughter. Ava, you just gave us a full paragraph about how you made the wings on a scrapwork dragon figure. Unprompted. Avaline spluttered incoherently for a moment, searching for a counter, but in the end it was Tika who spoke up.
Hey, it's not a bad thing. Brannigan tells me I'm a chatterbox, too,
she said before frowning.
Or, well, he says I'm a Tweety bird.
Avaline turned to Tika.
Tweety bird, huh? I think I prefer woodpecker.
Tika grinned before tilting her head back and performing a pretty convincing mimicry of a woodpecker attacking a tree. Avaline chuckled at the impromptu sound. And then someone cleared their throat. Tika squawked and spun around to see someone waiting patiently behind her, arms crossed. Sorry, can I get in here? He asked, nudging forward. Ah, a customer! Tyvis exclaimed, swiftly leaning forward. Tika, would you mind? Tika set down the dragon and quickly stepped back to give the customer space to shop. She felt a little silly, standing in the way of the flow of customers. Aveline gave her a small smile, then stepped over to speak with the customer, showing him her crafts and talking about them in detail. Tika listened in, genuinely fascinated by what she was hearing. She said nothing, though, as she found she had nothing to add. And so she just stood there, off to one side, awkwardly fidgeting. She held her hands politely behind her back and shifted her weight around on her feet. As she waited, she couldn't help but notice Tyvis glancing at her out of the corner of his eye whenever Avaline was leading the discussion. It was hard for Tika to read the human's face, but she felt like he was examining her more critically. After a few seconds, the customer left a small stack of coins on the table before making off with one of Avaline's crafts, a pleased smile on their face. Avaline waved them off, then turned back to Tika.
Sorry about that. It's a bigger crowd than usual this year.
Tika shook her head.
It's okay. We did say that we'd have more time to hang out and chat after you ran out of things to sell. I can wait, don't worry.
Avaline flinched.
I know. In hindsight, that probably wasn't a good idea. It doesn't feel right. You came all this way, and I don't want you getting bored or feeling like I'm ignoring you. Hey, I live in a literal shop. I get it, it's fine, don't worry.
Tika replied, shaking her head.
You do your thing.
Avaline looked down, kicking a stray stone.
But that's not fair on you.
Before the conversation could go any further, Tyvis spoke up. How about I solve all these problems and tell you two to just go and enjoy the festival together, Tika blinked, surprised. Avaline spun around to face her father.
Dad?
Tyvis waved her off. Go on. Go and have fun. I can hold down the shop without you, Ava. We still make money, your friend doesn't have to be bored, and you get a day off and a clean conscience. Everyone wins. Avaline stepped forward and put her hands on the stand.
Are you sure, Dad?
She asked quietly.
We've never had just one of us manning the stand. And it's a lot of people this year. You'll be swamped.
Tyvis smiled and put his hand on hers. You worry too much, Ava. I'm sure. Go spend time with your friend. Show her the sights. Have fun. You owe yourself that much. Tika blinked. There was a gravity behind those words. She could tell. There was a moment of tension in Tyvis's face, a lingering flash of something deep behind his eyes. It was gone as quickly as it had come, but Tika wasn't fooled into dismissing it. Whatever it was, it ran deep enough to be worthy of her respect. After a few seconds of quiet, Avaline nodded and slowly withdrew her hands.
Okay, Dad, if you're sure.
I'm sure. Go on. I'll keep things in hand here. Avaline nodded more to herself than to her father, then turned to Tika, a bright smile on her face.
Well, all right. I guess we're off the hook,
she said, an eager note in her voice.
We have the whole festival to go and see. What would you like to do first?
Tika hummed, tapping a finger to her beak as she looked around.
You know what? I have absolutely no idea. How about...
she mumbled, looking around for a few more seconds. Then her eyes landed on the crafts again. Specifically, the dragon. It was really nicely made, and she'd be lying if she said she didn't want to have one of Ava's creations sitting on her shelf. And so, with a smile, she stepped forward and pointed at the dragon.
I buy the dragon, and then you surprise me.
Tyvis grinned. I think that can be arranged. With her dragon trinket safely stowed away, Tika was guided by the hand out into the beating heart of the festival by a very eager Avaline. There was plenty to see and even more to do, and Avaline wasted no time in showing Tika around. First, Avaline took her to a glamorous tent decorated with shooting star motifs and artistic swirls. There was a fortune teller that Tika could tell was all show, if only because of all the glitz and glitter. Still, it was fun to surrender to the fantasy. Up next was a tent with a face painter, typically tending to children who just wanted to look silly. Tika, being the child at heart that she was only all too happy to let her beak receive similar treatment, though she would not let the painter touch her feathers. Those things were hard enough to clean at the best of times. Still, she and Avaline both left the tent giggling like maniacs, with Tika's beak as red as a macaw's feathers.
I'm a zombie, Kraven! Flee, or I'll peck out your brains! Ah!
She yelled at a gaggle of passing children, who turned and ran off with laughs and screams. They passed by an apple bobbing contest next. Avaline showed interest in that one, but they had to pass on it sadly. Tika pointed out that her beak would give her an unfair advantage. She would be able to snap up the apples with ease while all of the humans struggled with their weird, flexible lips and clunky teeth, and Avaline was unwilling to play a game while Tika just watched. They were here to spend time together after all, and so on they went.
Are our lips really so bad?
Avaline had questioned as they departed the space. Tika shrugged.
Not really. They're just not as good as an old-fashioned beak,
she declared. She clicked her beak several times to try and drive home the point. Avaline rolled her eyes.
But lips can kiss. Can a beak do that?
Tika drew up short, her mind stalling. A moment later, she turned to Avaline and mimicked an exaggeration of a kissing sound, much to the human girl's amusement. Tika harumphed in bemusement.
I guess not. Huh.
Avaline snickered, playfully pushed Tika, then took her hand and escorted her to their next activity. They stepped out into another square in the core of Archshade. To Tika's surprise, it was almost entirely clear of stalls. Instead, Tika's eyes were greeted by the delightful sight of an enormous mass of moving bodies. People were gathered into pairs and dancing along to an energetic song put on by a band on a central, elevated stage. This must have been the central dance square Avaline mentioned. She stared at them for only a second, and her foot was already tapping along to the rhythm, her head bobbing back and forth to the beat. She glanced beside her at Avaline, who was looking at her with a curious quirk on her brow. Tika frowned.
Huh. What?
Avaline smiled slyly.
You look like a chicken moving your head like that.
Tika squawked and stilled her head, though her foot kept tapping. Then she gave Avaline a stinky frown.
Hey! It's not like you humans look any better when you start nodding. You look like you're trying to throw your head off or something. I didn't say it was a bad thing.
Avaline defended with another musical giggle, lifting her hands in a placating gesture.
It's honestly kind of cute.
Tika's indignation faded, replaced once again with that omnipresent warmth. Her feathers puffed up a bit, and she fidgeted vainly to smooth them down.
Thanks,
she murmured. Avaline poked her in the cheek.
Adorable,
she furthered. Tika blushed even harder, her cheeks puffing up. She buried her face in her hands and let out a long, embarrassed groan. A moment later, she returned her attention to the dancing, and a thought came to her. She turned to Avaline.
Well, since we are here...
She held her hand out to Avaline and put on the most posh voice she could muster.
May I have this dance, milady?
Avaline stared at Tika's hand, dumbfounded.
What? Huh? You want to dance?
She asked. She did not say no, however, and gently took Tika's hand in her own. Tika tilted her head.
Isn't that why you brought me here?
Avaline coughed awkwardly into her hand.
In truth, I just wanted to listen to the music,
she confessed, idly toying with a strand of her hair.
I've never actually been one for dancing.
Tika nodded slowly. Not wanting to make Avaline uncomfortable or make her do something she didn't want to do, she began to release her hold on the girl's hand. To Tika's surprise, Avaline's grip suddenly tightened, keeping their hands firmly locked together. Avaline looked back to Tika with a shy smile.
That said, sure, why not?
Tika tilted her head the other way.
You sure?
She questioned.
I don't want to make you uncomfortable or anything.
Avaline nodded.
It's okay. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? And besides...
Her voice dropped to something a little less innocent.
I want to see if Kraven dancing is as cute as their head bobbing.
Tika clacked her beak. That sounded like a challenge. She wasn't entirely sure what the challenge was, but there was a challenge in there somewhere, and a proud Kraven never shied from a challenge except when they did.
Oh, Avaline, Avaline, Avaline. I'm gonna show you just how cute I can be,
she promised. Avaline did not flinch.
Oh, I believe you.
Tika let out a little growl. Or was it a purr? Details. Without a word, she gently guided the girl into the crowd of dancing humans, her feet already click-clacking and tapping along to the bard's music. The movements came naturally to her. She had experience with dancing from the occasional party thrown back in her home village. They were simple affairs most of the time, but no less energetic for it. The instruments employed by the population of Underbridge had long sounded foreign and exotic to her, but music was music, and Tika was very fond of music. Her entire body moved and swayed in time to the melodies, sending her twirling, springing, and skipping this way and that. Nearby, it could be said that Avaline was making an effort. To say that the human girl's dancing was stiff would be an understatement. Tika found the awkwardness endearing, though. It was like watching a kitten trying to figure out how to jump across a gap an adult cat would effortlessly clear. A little painful to watch, but endlessly charming all the same. And even with that outward awkwardness, Tika still spotted the inherent elegance she had seen in Avaline's movements when they first met. She couldn't help but smile and stare. And then she crashed into someone. Apparently, staring at your dance partner too intensely in these kinds of high-energy dances made it very easy to slam into someone you didn't know. Who knew? Well, Tika knew now, and so did her tailbone as she toppled to the side to land squarely on her rump on the cobbled ground. Above her, the woman she had bumped into yelped and shot her an offended glance before moving a little further away with her partner. Tika flushed with embarrassment, doubly so when Avaline's outstretched hand fell into her field of view. She looked up at Avaline's face. There was nothing but concern in her eyes.
Tika, are you okay?
Tika nodded, accepting the hand and getting back to her feet.
Yeah, I'm okay. Just, got a little distracted.
She confessed, rubbing at the back of her head. Avaline looked off to the side, biting her lip.
I noticed. You were staring at me.
She said quietly, her voice reluctant.
I know. I'm not a very good dancer. I must be making a fool of myself.
Tika blinked, surprised by the sudden self-deprecation. A moment later, however, she put on her warmest smile and took hold of Avaline's hand. Once she had the human's gaze, she shook her head.
No, your dancing's fine,
she said honestly. Then she winked.
In fact, I'd say it's cute. I'm basically just running in place, and that's what makes it cute.
Avaline giggled, and her expression softened considerably.
Thanks,
she muttered softly. Tika grinned. Then she took a step back, keeping Avaline's hand held firmly in her own. Avaline made no effort to resist and seemed to understand Tika's intentions pretty quickly. Tika pulled her with firm assurance back into the dancing mass, and this time, they danced with one another, rather than next to each other. To Tika, this was far more enjoyable. Judging by the look on Avaline's face, the feeling was mutual.